I texted the family group chat. Flight lands at 5 p.m. Can someone pick me up? I had just buried my mother overseas. My wife replied, "We're busy, try Uber." My wife's sister added, "Why didn't you plan better?" I simply wrote, "No worries." What they saw on the news that night made them drop their phones. My name is Marcus Reed. And if you're expecting some sob story about how life dealt me a crappy hand, well, buckle up, Buttercup, because that's exactly what you're getting. But here's the thing. I'm not looking for your pity. I'm way past that stage of grief. Thank you very much. 3 days ago, I buried my mother in Lagos, Nigeria. Now, before you start thinking this is some exotic tale about international jet setting, let me stop you right there. This wasn't a vacation. This was me honoring the last wish of the woman who basically single-handedly kept me from becoming a complete disaster of a human being. She'd always said she wanted to be laid to rest in her hometown, back where her story began, and hell if I wasn't going to make sure that happened. You want to know what it's like burying your mom halfway across the world? It's like trying to say goodbye while speaking a language you barely remember, surrounded by faces that look familiar but feel foreign, all while your heart is doing this weird thing where it's simultaneously breaking and trying to hold itself together with emotional duct tape. My mother. God, where do I even start with this woman? She raised me alone, which in today's world basically makes her a superhero without the fancy costume. While other kids were complaining about their allowances, Mom was working 3 jobs just to keep the lights on. She cleaned offices at night, waited tables during lunch rushes, and somehow still managed to help me with homework at the kitchen table that wobbled because one leg was shorter than the others. We never had much money, but man, did we have determination. She gave everything. And I mean everything. I remember when I was 12 and desperately wanted these sneakers that all the cool kids were wearing. Cost more than what she made in a week, but somehow, magically, those shoes appeared under our pathetic excuse for a Christmas tree. Found out years later, she'd been eating ramen noodles for dinner for 2 months straight to save up for them. That's the kind of woman she was. She'd give you the shirt off her back, even if it meant she'd freeze. So when the doctors said the cancer was aggressive and she had maybe 6 months, you bet your ass I was going to honor her final wish. I flew overseas with just a suit, the same black one I'd worn to my wedding, my job interviews, and now this, a folded speech I'd written and rewritten about 50 times on the plane, and the crushing weight of everything she'd ever sacrificed for me sitting on my chest like a concrete block. The flight to Lagos was brutal. 14 hours of staring at the back of airplane seats, trying not to think about how empty the house was going to feel when I got back. You know that feeling when you're on a plane and you look out the window and everything below looks tiny and insignificant? Yeah, well, that's exactly how I felt, except I was the tiny, insignificant thing floating through space. When we finally landed, Nigeria hit me like a wall of humid air and memories I didn't even know I had. The smell of street food, the sound of languages mixing together like some beautiful chaos, the way the sun felt different on your skin. It was like stepping into a photograph my mother had described to me 1,000 times, but I'd never actually seen. The funeral home was this modest building that had seen better decades, but the people there treated my mother like she was royalty returning home. They dressed her in this gorgeous traditional outfit that made her look peaceful in a way I hadn't seen in months. For the first time since the diagnosis, she looked like herself again, not like the frail shadow that cancer had tried to make her. The service was beautiful in that heartbreaking way that funerals can be. People I'd never met told stories about my mother as a young woman, how she used to sing in the church choir, how she'd help neighbors with their kids, how everyone knew she was destined for something bigger than their small town. And she was destined to raise me, even if she had to cross an ocean to do it. I gave my speech, though honestly, I'm not sure how I managed to get through it without completely falling apart. I talked about her strength, her sacrifice, her laugh that could fill up a room and make everyone forget their problems for a while. I told them about the woman who worked 3 jobs and still found time to teach me right from wrong, who never let me use our circumstances as an excuse to be anything less than my best. When the service ended and the last handful of soil hit her casket with that final, terrible thud, I just stood there. 10 minutes. Maybe 15. I couldn't move. The other mourners had started to drift away, offering their condolences and headed back to their lives, but I was frozen in place like some kind of statue dedicated to grief. I couldn't cry anymore. Seriously, it was like my tear ducts had gone on strike after 3 days of overtime. I was hollow, empty, like someone had scooped out everything inside me and left just the shell standing there in the Nigerian heat. It's a weird feeling, being completely empty but somehow still functioning. Like being a robot that someone forgot to program with emotions. The flight home was its own special kind of torture. 12 hours of airplane peanuts and recycling air while trying to figure out how to go back to normal life, when nothing felt normal anymore. How do you just go back to paying bills and taking out trash when you've just buried the most important person in your life on another continent? Just before takeoff, sitting in that cramped middle seat because apparently grief doesn't qualify you for an upgrade, I pulled out my phone and sent one text to the family group chat. You know, that group chat that every family has where people share memes and argue about who's hosting Thanksgiving and pretend to care about each other's daily drama. Flight lands at 5 p.m. Can someone pick me up? That's it. Simple. Not dramatic. No emotional manipulation. No guilt trips. No please. I just buried my mother and I'm falling apart. Just a straightforward request from a man who'd just done the hardest thing he'd ever had to do and needed a ride home from the airport. Just a son coming home from burying his mother, hoping that maybe, just maybe, someone in his family would be there for him. I hit send and stared out the tiny airplane window at the clouds forming walls between me and the life I was flying back to. Somewhere below those clouds was home, whatever that meant now. Somewhere down there was my wife Sierra, my life, my routine, everything that was supposed to matter. But sitting in that plane, 30,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean, clutching my phone like a lifeline, I had this strange feeling in my gut. Call it intuition, call it pessimism, call it whatever you want. But something told me that the responses waiting for me were going to hurt way more than saying goodbye ever could. My name is Marcus Reed, and if you're expecting some sob story about how life dealt me a crappy hand, well, buckle up, Buttercup, because that's exactly what you're getting. But here's the thing, I'm not looking for your pity. I'm way past that stage of grief, thank you very much. 3 days ago, I buried my mother in Lagos, Nigeria. Now, before you start thinking this is some exotic tale about international jet setting, let me stop you right there. This wasn't a vacation. This was me honoring the last wish of the woman who basically single-handedly kept me from becoming a complete disaster of a human being. She'd always said she wanted to be laid to rest in her hometown, back where her story began, and hell if I wasn't going to make sure that happened. You want to know what it's like burying your mom halfway across the world? It's like trying to say goodbye while speaking a language you barely remember, surrounded by faces that look familiar but feel foreign, all while your heart is doing this weird thing where it's simultaneously breaking and trying to hold itself together with emotional duct tape. My mother. God, where do I even start with this woman? She raised me alone, which in today's world basically makes her a superhero without the fancy costume. While other kids were complaining about their allowances, Mom was working 3 jobs just to keep the lights on. She cleaned offices at night, waited tables during lunch rushes, and somehow still managed to help me with homework at the kitchen table that wobbled because one leg was shorter than the others. We never had much money, but man, did we have determination. She gave everything. And I mean everything. I remember when I was 12 and desperately wanted these sneakers that all the cool kids were wearing. Cost more than what she made in a week, but somehow, magically, those shoes appeared under our pathetic excuse for a Christmas tree. Found out years later, she'd been eating ramen noodles for dinner for 2 months straight to save up for them. That's the kind of woman she was. She'd give you the shirt off her back, even if it meant she'd freeze. So when the doctors said the cancer was aggressive and she had maybe 6 months, you bet your ass I was going to honor her final wish. I flew overseas with just a suit, the same black one I'd worn to my wedding, my job interviews, and now this. A folded speech I'd written and rewritten about 50 times on the plane, and the crushing weight of everything she'd ever sacrificed for me sitting on my chest like a concrete block. The flight to Lagos was brutal. 14 hours of staring at the back of airplane seats, trying not to think about how empty the house was going to feel when I got back. You know that feeling when you're on a plane and you look out the window and everything below looks tiny and insignificant? Yeah, well, that's exactly how I felt. Except I was the tiny, insignificant thing floating through space. When we finally landed, Nigeria hit me like a wall of humid air and memories I didn't even know I had. The smell of street food, the sound of languages mixing together like some beautiful chaos, the way the sun felt different on your skin. It was like stepping into a photograph my mother had described to me 1,000 times, but I'd never actually seen. The funeral home was this modest building that had seen better decades, but the people there treated my mother like she was royalty returning home. They dressed her in this gorgeous traditional outfit that made her look peaceful in a way I hadn't seen in months. For the first time since the diagnosis, she looked like herself again, not like the frail shadow that cancer had tried to make her. The service was beautiful in that heartbreaking way that funerals can be. People I'd never met told stories about my mother as a young woman. How she used to sing in the church choir, how she'd help neighbors with their kids, how everyone knew she was destined for something bigger than their small town. And she was. She was destined to raise me, even if she had to cross an ocean to do it. I gave my speech, though honestly, I'm not sure how I managed to get through it without completely falling apart. I talked about her strength, her sacrifice, her laugh that could fill up a room and make everyone forget their problems for a while. I told them about the woman who worked 3 jobs and still found time to teach me right from wrong, who never let me use our circumstances as an excuse to be anything less than my best. When the service ended and the last handful of soil hit her casket with that final, terrible thud, I just stood there. 10 minutes. Maybe 15. I couldn't move. The other mourners had started to drift away, offering their condolences and headed back to their lives. But I was frozen in place like some kind of statue dedicated to grief. I couldn't cry anymore. Seriously, it was like my tear ducts had gone on strike after 3 days of overtime. I was hollow, empty, like someone had scooped out everything inside me and left just the shell standing there in the Nigerian heat. It's a weird feeling, being completely empty but somehow still functioning. Like being a robot that someone forgot to program with emotions. The flight home was its own special kind of torture. 12 hours of airplane peanuts and recycling air while trying to figure out how to go back to normal life, when nothing felt normal anymore. How do you just go back to paying bills and taking out trash when you've just buried the most important person in your life on another continent? Just before takeoff, sitting in that cramped middle seat because apparently grief doesn't qualify you for an upgrade, I pulled out my phone and sent one text to the family group chat. You know, that group chat that every family has where people share memes and argue about who's hosting Thanksgiving and pretend to care about each other's daily drama. Flight lands at 5 p.m. Can someone pick me up? That's it. Simple. Not dramatic. No emotional manipulation. No guilt trips. No please. I just buried my mother and I'm falling apart. Just a straightforward request from a man who'd just done the hardest thing he'd ever had to do and needed a ride home from the airport. Just a son coming home from burying his mother, hoping that maybe, just maybe, someone in his family would be there for him. I hit send and stared out the tiny airplane window at the clouds forming walls between me and the life I was flying back to. Somewhere below those clouds was home, whatever that meant now. Somewhere down there was my wife Sierra, my life, my routine, everything that was supposed to matter. But sitting in that plane, 30,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean, clutching my phone like a lifeline, I had this strange feeling in my gut. Call it intuition, call it pessimism, call it whatever you want. But something told me that the responses waiting for me were going to hurt way more than saying goodbye ever could. We landed at exactly 5:04 p.m., which meant I was officially 4 minutes late to my own abandonment party. The pilot came on the intercom with that practiced cheerfulness they all have, welcoming us to Atlanta and reminding everyone to check the overhead bins for personal belongings. Yeah, thanks Captain Obvious, because forgetting my carry-on was definitely my biggest concern right now. I stayed in my seat until most of the plane had emptied out. Call it procrastination, call it dread, call it whatever you want. I just wasn't ready to face whatever fresh hell was waiting for me on the other side of that jet bridge. The flight attendant gave me one of those polite but concerned looks, the kind they probably learn in training for dealing with passengers who are clearly having some kind of breakdown. Sir? We've arrived, she said, like maybe I'd missed the memo about the plane stopping and the doors opening. Yeah, I got it, I muttered, finally forcing myself to stand up and grab my bag. My legs felt like jello, which was probably a combination of the 14-hour flight, the emotional exhaustion, and the growing realization that I was about to walk into the airport with absolutely no one waiting for me. The walk through the terminal was like some kind of twisted social experiment. Everywhere I looked, there were reunions happening. Kids running into their parents' arms, couples embracing like they'd been separated for years instead of days, families holding up those cheesy, "Welcome home" signs with balloons and flowers. It was like the universe was putting on a little show just for me. Hey Marcus, look at all these people who have families that actually give a damn. I made it to baggage claim, which was its own special circle of hell. You know that feeling when you're standing around a carousel, watching everyone else's luggage come out while yours is apparently taking a scenic tour of the airport? Well, imagine that, except instead of waiting for your suitcase, you're waiting for some sign that maybe, just maybe, someone decided to show up for you after all. The carousel started moving, and people began clustering around it like vultures waiting for roadkill. I found a spot near the back and tried to look casual, like I wasn't scanning every face in the crowd hoping to see Sierra or Brooke or hell, even my neighbor's dog at this point. Anyone who might represent some form of human connection. But nope, nothing, nada, zilch. Families were reuniting all around me, and I felt like I was watching it all through bulletproof glass. There was this old couple. The man must have been 80 if he was a day, holding up a sign that said, "Welcome home, Sarah," with hand-drawn hearts around the edges. When a woman about my age came running toward them, all three of them started crying happy tears. Happy tears. I'd forgotten those were even a thing. Then there was this military guy, couldn't have been more than 25, still in his uniform. And when he walked out of the secure area, this entire extended family erupted in cheers. Someone had brought a banner. Someone else had brought what looked like a marching band. And there were probably 15 people there just to welcome one guy home. The kid looked embarrassed, but happy. The kind of embarrassed you get when people love you so much they don't care about making a scene in public. And me? I was standing there like the invisible man, watching other people's joy while my phone stayed stubbornly silent and my family stayed stubbornly absent. My suitcase finally decided to make its grand entrance, looking a little worse for wear after its international adventure. I grabbed it and started heading toward the exit, trying to figure out how the hell I was going to get home without completely draining my already pathetic bank account. The Uber surge pricing was probably going to be brutal at this time of day, and I was already calculating whether I had enough left on my credit card to cover it. But then something weird happened. As I walked past all the waiting families and reunion scenes, heading toward the rideshare pickup area like some kind of defeated soldier, I noticed a black SUV pull up quietly to the curb. Not in the designated pickup zone, not following any of the normal airport traffic rules, just sliding up to the sidewalk like it owned the place. The back door opened, and out stepped Darius. Now, Darius isn't technically my family, but he might as well be. He's my godmother's son, and my godmother was my mother's best friend since they were kids in Lagos. Darius is built like a brick house and has this presence that makes you feel safer just by being in the same zip code. Former Army Ranger, current pain in the ass to anyone who messes with people he cares about. But here's the thing that really got me. He wasn't alone. Sitting in that SUV were two women in black dresses, and I recognized them immediately. Mrs. Johnson and Mrs. Williams from my mother's church choir. These women had known my mother for 20 years, had sung with her every Sunday, had brought casseroles when she got sick, and had probably prayed for her every single day since her diagnosis. They weren't family by blood. Hell, Mrs. Johnson wasn't even the same race as me. Mrs. Williams barely spoke English as a first language. But they were there. They were present. They had shown up when my actual family couldn't be bothered to send anything more than a text message telling me to call a cab. Darius walked over to me with that measured stride he's had since his military days, and when he got close enough, he didn't say anything sappy or emotional. He just nodded and said, "Ready to go home, brother?" That's when I noticed something else that made my brain do a little double take. Behind the SUV, a second car had pulled up. Nothing fancy, just a regular sedan, but what caught my attention was the guy getting out of it. Middle-aged, carrying a camera, with that slightly rumpled look that screamed local news reporter. He walked over to Darius, and they had a brief conversation I couldn't hear over the airport traffic. Then the reporter looked at me, nodded once in that professional way that somehow manages to be both respectful and businesslike, and I found myself nodding back. Mrs. Johnson rolled down her window and called out to me in that voice that had been singing hymns for decades. Marcus, baby, we're so sorry for your loss. Your mama was a beautiful soul. Mrs. Williams leaned over and added, she raised a good man. We're here for you, Mijo. And right there, standing on the curb outside Atlanta's airport, surrounded by strangers hurrying to their own destinations, I realized something that hit me like a freight train. Sometimes the people who show up for you aren't the ones you expect. Sometimes family isn't about blood or marriage certificates or group chats. Sometimes it's about who gets in their car and drives to the airport when you need them most. Darius opened the SUV door for me, and as I climbed in, I caught the reporter adjusting his camera settings. That's when I realized that whatever was about to happen next, it was going to be bigger than just a ride home. And honestly, after the day I'd had, I was ready for bigger. You know what's funny about local news? Most of the time, nobody gives a damn about it. People are too busy scrolling through TikTok or arguing with strangers on Twitter to pay attention to what's happening in their own backyard. But sometimes, just sometimes, a story hits different, and suddenly everyone's glued to their TV screens like it's the Super Bowl. I was sitting in my living room at exactly 9 p.m., nursing a beer that tasted like disappointment and trying to pretend I wasn't waiting for Sierra to come home. She'd sent a text around 7 saying she was having dinner with Brooke, which was code for, we're probably talking about what a drama queen you're being about the whole airport thing. The twins were at their grandparents' house, which meant I had the place to myself and way too much time to think. The local news came on with all the usual fanfare. You know the drill. Overly enthusiastic anchors with perfect teeth talking about traffic accidents and city council meetings like they're breaking news from the front lines of some war. First up was sports, because apparently the Braves losing another game was more important than actual human interest stories. Then came the weather segment, with that meteorologist who always acts surprised when it rains in Georgia during the summer. Well, folks, looks like we're in for another hot and humid weekend. No shit, Sherlock. It's August in the South. Might as well tell us the sun is going to rise tomorrow while you're at it. I was about to change the channel when the anchor, this woman named Michelle something or other with that perfect newscaster hair that probably takes an hour to achieve, shifted gears and said something that made me nearly choke on my beer. Coming up after the break, a son returns from his mother's overseas funeral and sends a message without speaking a word. Wait, what now? I sat up straighter, suddenly very awake and very confused. There was no way they were talking about me, right? I mean, what were the odds that some random news crew just happened to be at the airport when I landed? But even as I was trying to convince myself it was some weird coincidence, my stomach was doing these little flip-flops that told me otherwise. The commercial break felt like it lasted forever. Car dealerships promising the best deals in town, restaurants advertising happy hour specials, lawyers claiming they could get you the compensation you deserved. All the usual local TV nonsense that normally would have had me reaching for the remote. But I sat there, frozen, watching some guy in a cowboy hat tell me about his used car a lot like my life depended on it. Finally, mercifully, the commercials ended, and Michelle was back with that serious but compassionate expression they teach in journalism school. Good evening, I'm Michelle Torres, and tonight we bring you a story that's been making waves on social media since this afternoon. Social media? What the hell was she talking about? I don't even have a Facebook account, and my Instagram is basically just pictures of food and the occasional sunset. How could I be making waves on social media? But then the footage started rolling, and holy shit, there I was. It was weird seeing yourself on TV when you didn't know you were being filmed. Like watching a movie of your own life that someone else directed. The camera caught me stepping out of Darius's SUV, and I looked. I don't know, different than I expected. Tired, obviously, but there was something in my posture, something in the way I was moving that looked almost dignified. I was carrying my mother's folded burial cloth across my chest, something I'd done without really thinking about it, just because it felt right to keep her close to me for as long as possible. On TV, though, it looked intentional, meaningful, like I was making some kind of statement instead of just trying to hold on to the last physical piece of my mother that I had. The camera followed me as Darius walked behind me. This imposing figure in a black suit who looked like he could bench press a small car. Mrs. Johnson and Mrs. Williams flanked me on either side. These two church ladies in their Sunday best, moving with the kind of grace that comes from decades of processing into sanctuaries and walking with purpose. We looked like, we looked like family. Real family. The kind that shows up when it matters. The reporter's voiceover was playing over the footage, explaining how I'd just returned from my mother's funeral in Nigeria, how I'd asked for a ride from the airport, how instead of family, I was met by friends from my mother's church community. He didn't mention Sierra by name, didn't throw anyone under the bus, but the implication was crystal clear. This man's blood relatives were nowhere to be found. Then came the moment that made my throat tighten up. The camera caught me handing a small ribbon box to Mrs. Johnson. My mother's last donation to the church's orphanage program. It was something she'd prepared before she died. $20 in cash and a handwritten note telling the kids to dream big and work hard. Not much money, but it was everything she had left to give. On TV, that moment looked powerful. The way Mrs. Johnson received the box with both hands, the way she pressed it to her heart, the way Mrs. Williams put her arm around my shoulders, it told a story without anyone having to say a word. It was a story about love, about legacy, about the kind of family you choose when the one you're born into lets you down. The footage was only about 2 minutes long, but it felt like watching a documentary about someone else's life. Someone braver than I felt, someone more composed than I remembered being, someone who had his shit together even when his world was falling apart. Michelle came back on screen with that practiced sympathy that news anchors perfect over years of reporting on other people's tragedies. The footage was captured this afternoon at Hartsfield-Jackson Airport and has already been shared over 1,000 times across various social media platforms. We reached out to Mr. Reed for comment, but he has not yet responded to our request. 1,000 times. People were sharing a video of me walking through an airport? What was I? Some kind of viral sensation now. The whole thing felt surreal, like I'd accidentally stumbled into someone else's story and couldn't find my way back to my own life. But here's the thing that really got me. Watching that footage, seeing myself through someone else's camera, I realized I didn't look like a victim. I didn't look like someone who'd been abandoned or betrayed or left hanging by his own family. I looked like a man who'd done what needed to be done, who'd honored his mother's memory, and who'd found dignity in the midst of loss. The segment ended with Michelle saying something about the power of community and chosen family, and then they moved on to a story about road construction on I-285. Just like that, my life was relegated to a 2-minute segment between weather and traffic updates. I sat there staring at the TV long after they'd moved on to other stories, trying to process what I'd just seen. Somewhere out there, 1,000 people had watched me walk through an airport carrying my dead mother's burial cloth. 1,000 strangers had seen me being supported by people who weren't even related to me, while my actual family was nowhere to be found. And I had a feeling that those 1,000 people were about to become a lot more than 1,000. My phone was sitting on the coffee table, face down and silent. But I could practically feel it heating up with notifications I wasn't ready to check. Because if I knew anything about the internet, it was that stories like this don't just disappear quietly into the night. They spread. They grow. They take on a life of their own. And sometimes, when you least expect it, they change everything. 24 hours. That's how long it took for the deafening silence to finally break. 24 glorious hours of radio silence from the family group chat that had delivered such gems as, "We're busy. Try Uber." And "Why didn't you plan better?" I was starting to think maybe they'd all collectively decided to pretend the whole airport thing never happened, which honestly would have been fine by me at that point. But no, that would have been too easy. And if there's one thing I've learned about family drama, it's that it never stays buried for long. It's like a zombie in a horror movie. Just when you think it's dead and gone, it comes crawling back to bite you in the ass. I was sitting in my home office, trying to focus on some work emails that had piled up while I was in Nigeria, when my phone buzzed with a private message. Not the group chat, a direct message from Brooke. Which was weird because Brooke never messaged me directly. Usually, all communication went through Sierra, like I was some kind of dangerous criminal who needed a handler. "Was that you on Channel 4? 5 words. 5 simple words that somehow managed to pack more passive-aggressive energy than a suburban mom arguing with a store manager about expired coupons. Not, "Hey, saw you on the news, are you okay?" Not, "Sorry we missed your call. That looked like a beautiful tribute to your mother." Just the bare minimum acknowledgement that yes, she had seen me on television, and yes, she was mildly curious about whether it was actually me or just some random guy who looked exactly like her brother-in-law. I stared at that message for a solid 10 minutes, trying to figure out what the appropriate response was. Part of me wanted to type back something sarcastic like, "Nope, just some other devastatingly handsome guy whose family abandoned him at the airport." Another part of me wanted to ignore it completely, let her stew in her own awkwardness while I went about my life. But you know what I did? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. I read the message, set my phone down, and went back to answering emails about quarterly reports and budget projections. Because sometimes the most powerful response is no response at all. Meanwhile, the internet was doing that thing the internet does when it sinks its teeth into a story. The local news segment had apparently found its way onto Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and probably a dozen other platforms I didn't even know existed. My phone kept buzzing with notifications that I was steadfastly ignoring, but I could see the numbers climbing every time I glanced at the screen. The funny thing about going viral, and I use that term loosely because we're talking about local Atlanta news here, not exactly global phenomenon territory, is that you become a character in other people's stories whether you want or not. Suddenly, everyone's got an opinion about your life, your choices, your family situation. It's like being the subject of a really weird social experiment where strangers get to judge your personal drama from the comfort of their own homes. But here's where it gets interesting. While I was busy not responding to Brooke's passive-aggressive fishing expedition, Sierra was apparently having her own little crisis management moment. Because at around 3 p.m., she posted something on her Instagram that made my eye twitch so hard I probably looked like I was having a seizure. It was an old family photo. One of those classic beach vacation shots where everyone's tan and smiling and pretending to be the perfect American family. Me, Sierra, and the twins building sandcastles and looking like we'd stepped out of a tourism brochure. The caption read, "Family is everything. Family is everything. Are you freaking kidding me right now?" The woman who told me to try Uber when I needed a ride home from burying my mother was posting inspirational quotes about family on social media. It was like watching someone set fire to their own house and then complaining about the smoke. But here's the thing about the internet. It doesn't forget, and it sure as hell doesn't let things slide. Within an hour of Sierra posting that saccharine family photo, the comments section had turned into a digital battlefield. And let me tell you, people were not holding back. The top comment, the one that got liked and shared more than all the others, was from someone I didn't even recognize. "You couldn't even pick him up from the airport." 7 words. 7 brutal, honest, call out your bullshit words that cut through Sierra's carefully crafted image like a hot knife through butter. And it wasn't some anonymous troll hiding behind a fake profile. It was from someone named Jennifer Martinez, who apparently had mutual friends with Sierra and had seen the news coverage. More comments kept rolling in. "Saw the news story. Where were you? Actions speak louder than Instagram captions. That man buried his mother, and you told him to call an Uber? Really?" It was like watching a masterclass in digital karma. Every comment was a little arrow pointing directly at the hypocrisy of posting about family values while actively failing to demonstrate any. The internet had done what I couldn't, or wouldn't, do myself. It had called out the bullshit without me having to say a single word. And the sharing. Oh man, the sharing was something else. That Instagram post got screenshot and shared across platforms faster than gossip at a church potluck. People were reposting it with their own commentary, dissecting the irony, adding their own stories about family disappointment and abandonment. Sierra's attempt at damage control had backfired spectacularly, turning into a case study in how not to handle a PR crisis. I found myself refreshing her post obsessively, watching the comment count climb and the like-to-comment ratio shift into seriously unfavorable territory. It was petty, sure, but after the week I'd had, I figured I was entitled to a little schadenfreude. Sometimes the universe delivers justice in the most unexpected ways, and sometimes that justice comes in the form of strangers on the internet calling out your wife's tone-deaf social media presence. The best part? I didn't have to do anything. I didn't have to defend myself, didn't have to argue, didn't have to explain my side of the story. The truth was right there in black and white, or in this case, in high-definition video footage. I'd buried my mother with dignity, asked for help, been refused, and found support from people who actually cared. The internet had connected the dots all by themselves. By evening, the post had been shared so many times that it was showing up in Facebook groups I'd never heard of Reddit threads about family drama, and Twitter conversations about the difference between blood family and chosen family. Someone had even turned it into a meme, though I'm not sure how I felt about being meme-iffy during my grief process. Sierra deleted the post around 8 p.m. Just vanished it into the digital ether like it had never existed. But the internet is forever, and screenshots are eternal. The damage was done, the message was sent, and the city, hell, probably half the Southeast by now, had seen exactly what kind of family is everything situation I was dealing with. I never did respond to Brooke's message. Never acknowledged Sierra's social media meltdown. Never engaged with any of it directly. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let other people reveal themselves. Sometimes the truth speaks so loudly that adding your own voice would just be redundant. And sometimes, when you're dealing with people who have shown you exactly who they are, the smartest move is to simply step back and let them prove your point for you. The call came on a Wednesday morning while I was eating cereal that had gone soggy because I'd been staring at my phone instead of actually eating breakfast like a functional human being. The number wasn't in my contacts, but it had that official look that made me think it was either someone trying to sell me extended car warranty or the IRS coming for my soul. Mr. Reed? This is Michelle Torres from Channel 4 News. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. Michelle Torres. The perfectly coiffed anchor who'd narrated my life story to half of Atlanta 2 days ago. The woman who'd turned my airport pickup into must-see TV without bothering to ask my permission first. And now she was calling me directly, which felt like being contacted by a celebrity, except the celebrity had already filmed a documentary about your personal drama. Depends on what you're calling about, I said, trying to sound casual while internally freaking out about why a news anchor had my personal phone number. Well, we've been getting quite a response to Monday's story, she said, and I could hear that professional warmth in her voice, the kind they probably teach in broadcast journalism classes. People are really connecting with what happened, and we were wondering if you'd be interested in telling your side of the story. My side of the story. Like there were multiple versions of events floating around, and mine was just one possible interpretation of reality. I mean, what other side could there be? I buried my mother, asked for a ride, got told to call an Uber, and ended up being picked up by people who actually gave a damn. Pretty straightforward narrative, if you ask me. I'm not really looking for media attention, I told her, which was true. The last thing I needed was to become some kind of poster child for family dysfunction. I just wanted to mourn my mother in peace and figure out how to rebuild my life without constantly wondering if the people closest to me were going to be there when I needed them. I understand, Michelle said, and she actually sounded like she meant it. But sometimes staying silent protects the wrong people. That sentence hit me like a freight train carrying a load of uncomfortable truths. Because she was right, wasn't she? My silence wasn't protecting me. It was protecting Sierra and Brooke from having to face the consequences of their actions. It was letting them continue to play victim while I sat quietly in the corner, absorbing all the emotional damage like some kind of human sponge. I'd spent my whole life being the guy who didn't make waves, who kept his mouth shut when family gatherings got awkward, who pretended everything was fine even when it clearly wasn't. Growing up with a single mother who worked 3 jobs had taught me to be grateful for what I had and not complain when things weren't perfect. But maybe there was a difference between being grateful and being a doormat. Can I think about it? I asked, because making big decisions while emotionally compromised seemed like a recipe for disaster. Of course. But Marcus, can I call you Marcus? I want you to know that this isn't about sensationalizing your pain. It's about showing people that dignity and grace can triumph over disappointment. That's the story people are responding to. After I hung up, I spent the next 3 hours pacing around my house like a caged animal, trying to figure out what the right move was. Part of me wanted to just let the whole thing blow over, go back to my normal life, and pretend none of this had happened. But another part of me, the part that was still carrying around the weight of those text messages, knew that some things don't just blow over. Some things fester and grow and turn into resentment that poisons everything else. I called Darius. If anyone was going to give me straight talk without sugarcoating, it was him. You thinking about doing the interview? He asked, because apparently I'm predictable enough that he could read my mind over the phone. Maybe. I don't know. Feels weird talking about family stuff on TV. Brother, Darius said in that voice he used when he was about to drop some serious wisdom. Sometimes the only way people learn is when their actions have consequences. And sometimes those consequences need to be public. That afternoon, I called Michelle back and said yes. The studio was smaller than I'd expected, all bright lights and cameras that looked like expensive robots. Michelle had traded her on-air perfection for a more casual look, still professional, but approachable in a way that made me feel less like I was about to be interrogated by the journalism police. "Just be yourself," she told me as they clipped a tiny microphone to my shirt. "Tell the truth. That's all anyone can ask for." The interview started with softball questions about my mother, about the funeral, about what it meant to honor her final wishes. Easy stuff that I could talk about without feeling like I was betraying anyone or airing dirty laundry on television. I told them about her strength, her sacrifice, her determination to give me a better life than the one she'd had. Then Michelle asked the question I'd been dreading. What happened when you landed back in Atlanta? I could have deflected, could have given some generic answer about being tired and overwhelmed, could have protected the very people who hadn't bothered to protect me. But sitting in that studio, with those lights shining down and that camera recording every word, I realized that Michelle had been right about silence protecting the wrong people. "I buried my mother with respect," I said, looking directly into the camera. "I came home to silence." 5 words. Just 5 words, but they carried the weight of everything I'd been holding inside since I sent that text message. No names, no specific accusations, no personal attacks. Just the simple, honest truth about what had happened. "Can you elaborate on that?" Michelle asked gently. "I asked my family for a ride home from the airport, after burying my mother, and I was told to try Uber." I paused, letting that sink in. The people who picked me up weren't even related to me. They were friends from my mother's church. People who understood that sometimes you show up for each other, even when it's inconvenient. Then I said the line that had been building up in my chest like pressure in a steam engine, the words that felt like they'd been waiting my whole life to be spoken. "Blood isn't family. Presence is." The studio was quiet for a moment, that kind of silence that happens when something true and heavy settles over a room like a blanket. Michelle nodded slowly, and I could see in her eyes that she understood the weight of what I'd just said. The interview ran for 6 minutes when it aired that night. 6 minutes that managed to capture everything I'd been feeling but couldn't figure out how to express. 6 minutes that told the story of a man who'd learned the difference between being related to someone and actually having family. But those 6 minutes shook the city like a thunderstorm in July, sudden and powerful and impossible to ignore. You know that feeling when you throw a pebble into a pond and suddenly realize it wasn't a pebble at all, but a boulder? That's exactly what happened after my interview aired. What I thought would be a small, local news segment about family disappointment turned into something that apparently struck a nerve with half the population of Georgia and beyond. The messages started coming in about an hour after the interview hit the airwaves. At first, it was just a few emails forwarded to me through the news station, people who had watched and wanted to share their own stories. I figured I'd get maybe a dozen responses, mostly from other people dealing with difficult family situations who could relate to what I'd been through. Boy, was I wrong. By midnight, I had over 200 messages. By the next morning, that number had tripled. My phone was buzzing so constantly that I had to put it on silent just to get some peace. The Channel 4 website had crashed twice from people trying to watch the interview online. Someone had uploaded it to YouTube, where it was getting thousands of views and comments that ranged from supportive to absolutely savage toward people who abandoned family members in their time of need. The messages themselves were something else entirely. I'd expected maybe some sympathy, some sorry for your loss type responses. What I got instead was a masterclass in human resilience and the universal experience of family disappointment. A man named Jorge wrote, "I saw the news. I was disowned after burying my father because I refused to give my inheritance to my brother's gambling debts. Thank you for speaking up for those of us who've been left behind by blood family." That one hit me right in the gut. Here was a guy who'd literally been cut off from his entire family for doing the right thing, and he was thanking me for having the guts to tell my story. It made me realize that what had happened to me wasn't some isolated incident of family dysfunction. It was part of a much bigger pattern of people being let down by the very people who were supposed to have their backs. Then there were the veterans. Oh man, the veterans really came out of the woodwork for this one. Apparently, my story had struck a chord with military families who understood what it meant to be abandoned by the people you're fighting to protect. Staff Sergeant Monica Williams wrote, Came home from 2 tours in Afghanistan to find my husband had cleaned out our bank account and filed for divorce. Spent my first night back sleeping in my car. Your story reminded me that the family I found in my unit was worth more than the one I lost at home. A Navy corpsman named David sent me a photo of his medal ceremony with a note. My parents couldn't be bothered to attend my Purple Heart ceremony because it conflicted with their golf tournament. The guys in my unit were my real family. Semper Fi to you for speaking truth. These weren't just random people sharing war stories. These were men and women who had literally put their lives on the line for their country, only to come home and discover that their sacrifices meant nothing to the people they trusted most. And somehow, my little airport drama had given them permission to acknowledge their own pain and disappointment. But it wasn't just military folks. Nurses wrote to tell me about working double shifts during COVID while their families complained about not seeing them enough for holidays. Single mothers shared stories about raising kids alone while ex-husbands' families acted like they didn't exist. Adult children of addicts talked about the exhaustion of being the only ones who showed up for family emergencies while siblings made excuses and disappeared when things got tough. One woman sent a letter, an actual handwritten letter, which was so old school it made me smile, with a photo of her mother's grave. She wrote, "I buried my mother alone because my 3 siblings said the funeral was too depressing for them to attend. I felt guilty about being angry with them for 2 years. Your interview made me realize that being angry was the appropriate response. Thank you for giving me permission to feel what I was already feeling. Permission to feel what you're already feeling." Damn, that phrase stuck with me for days. How many people are walking around carrying guilt about being upset with family members who've let them down? How many of us have been gaslit into thinking we're being dramatic or unreasonable for expecting basic human decency from the people who claim to love us? The responses kept coming. Teachers who'd worked through the pandemic while their families took vacations. Caregivers who'd spent years taking care of elderly parents while siblings contributed nothing but criticism. People who'd organized family reunions, holiday dinners, and birthday parties for years, only to have no one show up when they needed support themselves. But the message that really got to me came from someone unexpected. A woman named Patricia, who turned out to be a social worker specializing in family therapy, wrote, "In 30 years of practice, I've never seen anyone articulate the difference between biological family and chosen family as clearly as you did in 6 minutes. Your phrase, 'blood isn't family,' presence should be printed on business cards and handed out at every family gathering in America." She wasn't kidding. Within a week, that phrase was showing up on t-shirts, coffee mugs, and social media profiles across the Southeast. Someone had turned it into a meme with a photo of a chosen family gathering. A tattoo parlor in downtown Atlanta reported that they'd done 7 tattoos of those exact words in the span of 3 days. It was surreal, watching something I'd said in a moment of raw honesty turn into a rallying cry for people who'd felt invisible in their own families. But the really wild part was what happened next. About 2 weeks after the interview, I got an email that made me do a double take. It was from a group called Southern Roots Community Services, a volunteer organization that I'd never heard of. The subject line read, "Partnership Opportunity, the Return Home Network." The email was from a woman named Dr. Angela Martinez, who introduced herself as a grief counselor and community organizer. She'd seen the interview and had an idea that was so simple and so obvious that I couldn't believe no one had thought of it before. "What if," she wrote, "instead of just talking about how families sometimes fail us, we created an actual support system for people who find themselves alone during life's most difficult moments? What if we could guarantee that no one has to face a funeral, a medical emergency, or a major life transition without someone in their corner?" She outlined a vision for something she was calling the Return Home Network, a community-based volunteer organization that would provide practical and emotional support for people dealing with major life events without family support. Airport pickups were just the beginning. They were talking about hospital visits, funeral attendance, moving assistance, and emergency childcare for single parents. Not a charity, she emphasized. A movement. A way to formalize the kind of chosen family support that people like Darius, Mrs. Johnson, and Mrs. Williams had shown me at the airport. I stared at that email for about 20 minutes, reading it over and over again. Here was someone who'd taken my personal disaster and seen the blueprint for something bigger, something that could actually help people instead of just making good television. Without really thinking about it, I typed back 2 words, I'm in. Because sometimes the best way to heal from being abandoned is to make sure no one else has to experience that same abandonment. Sometimes the most powerful response to neglect is to create the presence you wish you'd had. You know what's funny about starting a movement? One minute you're just a guy who got abandoned at the airport, and the next minute you're coordinating volunteers across 3 major airports like you're running some kind of compassionate air traffic control center. Life has a twisted sense of humor sometimes. Within a week of Dr. Martinez and I officially launching the Return Home Network, we had 43 people sign up as volunteers. 43. I was expecting maybe a dozen do-gooders with too much time on their hands. Instead, we got retired teachers, off-duty nurses, military veterans, social workers, and even a few college students who just wanted to make sure nobody felt as alone as I had felt walking through that terminal. The logistics were actually pretty simple, which surprised the hell out of me. We created a basic website, nothing fancy, just a contact form and some information about what we offered. People could request support for airport pickups, hospital visits, funeral attendance, or just someone to sit with them during difficult times. Volunteers could sign up for different types of assistance based on their availability and comfort level. Mrs. Johnson, bless her heart, became our unofficial coordinator. This woman had been organizing church events for 30 years, so managing a volunteer schedule was like riding a bicycle for her. She set up a phone tree that would make a political campaign jealous and somehow convinced her entire church choir to join as backup volunteers. Suddenly, we had people available 24/7, which was both awesome and slightly terrifying. The first official pickup happened on a Thursday afternoon. A woman named Sarah was flying back from her father's funeral in Denver, and her brother, who was supposed to pick her up, had decided to go fishing instead. I'm not kidding. Fishing. Because apparently, catching bass was more important than supporting his grieving sister. Darius handled that pickup, and when Sarah walked out of the terminal to find this imposing ex-Army Ranger holding a sign with her name and a gentle smile, she started crying right there on the sidewalk. Not sad tears, relief tears. The kind of tears that come when you realize you're not as alone as you thought you were. Word spread faster than gossip at a small-town diner. The local news did a follow-up story about our first month of operations, and suddenly we were getting calls from airports in Birmingham, Nashville, and Charlotte. People wanted to start their own chapters, wanted to know how to replicate what we were doing in their communities. Someone donated a van. I'm still not sure who. The paperwork just showed up with the keys and a note that said for the people who show up. A retired chef named Carlos offered to prepare meals for families dealing with medical emergencies. A local florist started donating arrangements for funerals where the deceased didn't have family support. It was like watching kindness multiply in real time. Every person who got helped ended up wanting to help someone else. Sarah, the woman from the fishing brother incident, became one of our most dedicated volunteers. She said helping other people process their grief helped her process her own. But the really beautiful part wasn't the grand gestures. It was the small stuff. Like when Mrs. Williams would bring her famous banana bread to someone sitting alone in a hospital waiting room. Or when Darius would help an elderly man navigate the airport wheelchair system because his son was too busy to assist. Or when our college volunteers would just sit with someone who needed to talk about their loss without judgment or advice. We weren't just providing rides and meals. We were providing presence. We were showing people that their pain mattered, that their struggles were valid, that someone gave a damn about their well-being even when their blood relatives couldn't be bothered. And then, like clockwork, the guilt calls started coming. Sierra called first. I was in the middle of coordinating a hospital visit for a single mother whose family had written her off for having a kid out of wedlock when my phone rang with Sierra's name flashing on the screen. I hadn't heard from her since the Instagram debacle, and honestly, I'd been perfectly fine with that arrangement. I didn't pick up. Her voicemail was a masterpiece of manipulation disguised as vulnerability. Marcus, I didn't know how to be there for you. I was dealing with my own stuff, and I know that's not an excuse, but I want to try to make things right. Can we talk? She didn't know how to be there for me. What's so complicated about showing up at an airport? What's so difficult about saying, I'm sorry for your loss instead of try Uber? And what stuff was she dealing with that was more important than supporting her husband after his mother's funeral? I deleted the voicemail without listening to it twice. 3 days later, Brooke sent a $50 donation to our website. 15 with a note. For the good work you're doing. B. No apology. No acknowledgement of what had happened. Just $50 and her initial. Like she was making a contribution to some random charity instead of trying to assuage her guilt for abandoning her brother-in-law during the worst week of his life. I didn't acknowledge it. Didn't send a thank you note. Didn't mention it in our volunteer newsletter. Didn't even record her name in our donor database. Because this wasn't about money, and it sure as hell wasn't about letting people buy their way out of accountability. Dr. Martinez had a phrase for situations like this. Bridges, not begging. She'd seen it happen before. People who'd been called out for their behavior would make token gestures to try to repair relationships without actually addressing the underlying issues. They wanted the bridge back without acknowledging why it had been burned in the first place. You can't build a relationship on guilt payments and non-apology apologies, she told me during one of our weekly planning meetings. Either they understand what they did wrong and are willing to do the work to fix it, or they don't. There's no middle ground with this kind of thing. She was right. This wasn't about revenge or holding grudges or making Sierra and Brooke suffer for their choices. This was about truth. And the truth was that some people show up when it matters, and some people don't. Some people understand that love is a verb, not just a feeling, and some people think saying they love you is enough without ever demonstrating it through their actions. The Return Home Network was building bridges, real ones, based on mutual respect and genuine care. We were connecting people who needed support with people who were willing to provide it. No strings attached, no guilt trips included. We were creating the kind of family that shows up not because they have to, but because they want to. Sierra's phone calls and Brooke's guilt money, those were just reminders of what we were building away from. Those were examples of the old model, where relationships were based on obligation and manipulation instead of authentic connection and voluntary care. I had 45 volunteers across 8 cities who understood the difference between presence and performance. I had people like Mrs. Johnson, who would drive across town at midnight to sit with a stranger in an emergency room. I had people like Darius, who treated every airport pickup like he was welcoming home family. That's the bridge I was interested in building. Not the kind that gets reconstructed out of guilt and torn down again the next time someone can't be bothered to show up, but the kind that gets stronger every time someone crosses it. The kind of bridge that leads somewhere worth going. 6 weeks after my interview aired, I got invited to speak at something I never thought I'd be qualified for, a memorial event. Not for one specific person, but for an entire category of people that apparently existed in larger numbers than I'd ever imagined. The invitation came from the Georgia Bereavement Alliance, a statewide organization that supported people dealing with grief and loss. We'd like you to keynote our annual memorial for sons and daughters who buried their parents alone. The email read, your story has resonated with hundreds of people across the state who've had similar experiences. Sons and daughters who buried their parents alone. There was actually enough of us to warrant an annual memorial service. That's either really depressing or oddly comforting, depending on how you look at it. On one hand, it meant I wasn't some unique case of family dysfunction. On the other hand, it meant there were hundreds of people walking around carrying the same kind of pain I'd been dealing with. The event was held at a community center in Decatur, in one of those multi-purpose rooms that gets used for everything from wedding receptions to AA meetings. When I walked in, I expected to see maybe 30 or 40 people scattered around folding chairs, looking as uncomfortable as I felt about being there. Instead, I found nearly 200 people packed into that space. Young adults, middle-aged professionals, elderly folks who'd buried their parents decades ago, but still carried the weight of having done it alone. The diversity was striking. Every race, every economic background, every age group you could imagine. Apparently, family abandonment is an equal opportunity disappointment. The organizer, a woman named Linda Patterson who'd buried both her parents without any sibling support, introduced me to the crowd with more enthusiasm than I probably deserved. Marcus Reed has become a voice for all of us who've learned that blood doesn't guarantee presence, she said, and the applause that followed felt both overwhelming and oddly therapeutic. Standing behind that podium, looking out at all those faces that carried their own versions of my story, I realized I had no idea what I was supposed to say. How do you address a room full of people who've been let down by the very people who were supposed to be their safety net? How do you find inspiration in collective abandonment? So I did what I'd been doing since this whole thing started. I told the truth. My name is Marcus Reed. I began, and 3 months ago, I thought I knew what family meant. I thought it was about shared DNA, shared history, shared obligations. I thought the people who'd known you longest would be the ones who'd stand by you strongest. A few heads nodded. Someone in the back row wiped their eyes. I was wrong about all of that. I told them about my mother. Not the sanitized version I'd given to the news cameras, but the real story. About how she'd worked 3 jobs and still found time to help me with algebra homework at our wobbly kitchen table. About how she'd saved for months to buy me those sneakers I'd wanted, eating ramen for dinner so I could fit in with the cool kids at school. About how she'd never once made me feel like a burden, even when raising me alone must have felt impossible. She taught me about courage, I said, about dignity, about showing up for the people you love, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. I talked about Nigeria, about honoring her final wish, about the weight of doing right by someone who'd spent her entire life doing right by you. About how burying your parent isn't just about grief. It's about carrying forward everything they taught you about how to be human in a world that doesn't always encourage humanity. Then I told them about coming home, about that text message, about those responses, about walking through the airport surrounded by other people's reunions while I headed toward surge pricing and small talk with an Uber driver. I came home to silence, I said, and the room got so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming. But I didn't stay silent. The applause was different this time. Not polite convention clapping, but the kind of recognition you get when people realize you've put words to something they'd been feeling but couldn't express. It was the sound of validation, of seeing your own experience reflected back at you by someone who understood the specific type of loneliness that comes with being failed by family. Here's what I learned. I continued. Sometimes, the people who don't show up teach you who to build for. I talked about the Return Home Network, about volunteers who drove across town at midnight to sit with strangers, about people who understood that presence is a choice you make every day, not just when it's convenient. About chosen family and the difference between loving someone because you have to and loving someone because you want to. We're not here tonight because we're victims, I said. We're here because we're survivors. We're here because we figured out how to honor our parents' memories even when our siblings couldn't be bothered to help. We're here because we learned that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is showing up when no one else will. The standing ovation lasted almost 5 minutes. People were crying, hugging strangers, sharing stories with people they'd just met, but who understood their pain in ways their own families never had. It was like watching a support group form in real time, bonded by the shared experience of carrying grief alone and finding strength in that solitude. After my speech, the formal program continued with a candle-lighting ceremony for all the parents who'd been buried by solitary children. Each person who wanted to could light a candle and say their parent's name, creating this wall of flickering light that represented love that persisted even after abandonment. But during the reception afterward, something happened that I wasn't prepared for. A man tapped my shoulder and said, "My brother was on your first airport pickup. You gave him hope when his own family gave him nothing." I turned around to thank him, to ask how his brother was doing, to maybe exchange contact information for future volunteer opportunities. But when I looked past him, my stomach dropped into my shoes. There, standing by the coffee table like she'd been invited to this thing, was Sierra. And right next to her, looking uncomfortable but determined, was Brooke. They weren't exactly blending in with the crowd of people who'd buried parents alone. They looked out of place, like tourists who'd wandered into the wrong cultural event. Sierra was wearing one of her nicer dresses, the kind she saved for important occasions, and she had that expression she got when she was trying to appear sympathetic but wasn't quite sure how to pull it off. Brooke was fidgeting with her purse strap, looking like she'd rather be anywhere else, but was there out of some misguided sense of obligation or damage control. They saw me see them. Sierra raised her hand in a tentative wave, like she was testing the waters to see if I'd acknowledge her presence. Brooke just stood there, probably calculating whether approaching me would make things better or worse. I had a choice to make. I could walk over there, have whatever conversation they'd come to have, deal with whatever guilt-driven agenda had brought them to a memorial service for people whose families had abandoned them. I could engage with their timing, their location choice, their apparent belief that showing up at this event somehow demonstrated their understanding of what I'd been through. Or I could do what I'd been doing for the past 2 months. I could choose presence over performance, authenticity over appearance, real connection over obligatory reconciliation. I didn't wave back. I didn't move toward them. I didn't pretend that their showing up at this particular event somehow erased their absence when it actually mattered. Instead, I turned back to the man who'd approached me, learned his name was Robert, and spent the next 20 minutes hearing about his brother's experience with our volunteer network. About how a simple airport pickup had turned into ongoing support, how Mrs. Johnson had helped his brother navigate the probate process when their other siblings had disappeared, how chosen family had filled the gaps left by blood relatives who couldn't be bothered. By the time I looked back toward the coffee table, Sierra and Brooke were gone. But the room was still full of people who understood that love is measured in presence, not promises. People who'd learned the same lesson I'd learned, that sometimes the greatest strength comes from accepting that some bridges aren't worth rebuilding, and focusing your energy on building new ones that lead somewhere worth going. 6 months later, I was sitting in what used to be my home office but had become the unofficial headquarters of the Return Home Network, staring at a notification on my phone that made me laugh out loud. Not because it was funny, but because the irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. The family group chat. The same one that had delivered those soul-crushing messages when I needed support most, was lighting up my phone like a Christmas tree. Apparently, Sierra had decided it was time to try a different approach to whatever reconciliation fantasy she'd been cooking up since the memorial service. I never reopened that chat after everything went down. Haven't looked at it once in 6 months. But you know how group texts work. They keep buzzing your phone even when you've mentally checked out of the conversation. Every notification was like a little reminder of the people who'd shown me exactly who they were when it mattered most. But I wasn't that same guy anymore. The Marcus who'd sent that desperate "can someone pick me up" text was gone, replaced by someone who'd learned the difference between being abandoned and being liberated. Turns out, when people show you they can't be counted on, believing them is the first step toward finding people who actually can. I never responded to Sierra's last voicemail either. You know, the one where she claimed she didn't know how to be there for me. Because here's the thing about not knowing how to be there for someone. It's not actually that complicated. You show up. You answer texts. You don't tell your grieving husband to call an Uber when he's coming home from burying his mother. It's basic human decency 101, not advanced emotional intelligence. The Return Home Network had grown beyond anything I'd imagined when Dr. Martinez first pitched the idea. We now had 45 volunteers across 8 cities, with expansion plans for 3 more locations by the end of the year. What started as a simple airport pickup service had evolved into something that looked more like a movement than a charity. We'd handled over 200 calls for support in 6 months. 200 people who'd found themselves alone during life's most difficult moments and discovered that strangers could provide the care their own families couldn't. Airport pickups, hospital visits, funeral attendants, emergency childcare, moving assistance. We'd become the safety net that was supposed to be provided by blood relatives, but often wasn't. The care kits were Mrs. Johnson's idea. She'd noticed that people dealing with grief or medical emergencies often forgot to take care of basic needs like eating or staying hydrated. So she started putting together these simple packages: bottled water, protein bars, tissues, a phone charger, and a handwritten note that said, "You're not alone." Nothing fancy, nothing expensive, just practical items delivered with genuine care. The welcome signs had become our signature. Darius designed them. Simple white poster board with the person's name written in bold black letters, decorated with a small heart in the corner. Not dramatic, not attention-seeking, just clear evidence that someone was there specifically for you. The number of people who'd broken down crying at the sight of their name on one of those signs was both heartbreaking and beautiful. Meal trains happened organically. Carlos, the retired chef, had started cooking for one family dealing with a medical crisis. And somehow that had morphed into a network of volunteers who provided home-cooked meals for people too overwhelmed by life circumstances to handle grocery shopping and cooking. We delivered over 500 meals in the past 4 months, ranging from Carlos's gourmet comfort food to Mrs. Williams' famous banana bread. But the real magic happened in the moments between the organized services. Like when Sarah, remember her, the woman with the fishing brother, spent 3 hours in a hospital waiting room with a man whose adult children lived 2 hours away but couldn't be bothered to visit during his cancer treatment. Or when one of our college volunteers helped an elderly woman navigate the Social Security office after her husband died because her own daughter was too busy to take time off work. Every time I saw someone walk out of an airport into waiting arms, every time I got a text from a volunteer who'd just helped someone through a crisis, every time someone told me that our network had made them feel less alone in the world, I knew we were doing something right. Not perfect, not revolutionary, but right in the way that simple human kindness is always right. The thing about building something meaningful is that it changes you in the process. I'd started this journey as a guy who'd been abandoned by his family and was looking for a way to prevent other people from experiencing that same abandonment. But somewhere along the way, it had become about something bigger than preventing pain. It had become about creating joy. Because that's what I saw in our volunteers' faces when they welcomed someone home from an airport. That's what I heard in people's voices when they called to thank us for showing up when no one else would. That's what I felt every time someone who'd been helped by our network signed up to become a volunteer themselves, completing this beautiful cycle of care that fed itself and grew stronger with each act of kindness. Sometimes, when I was updating our volunteer database or coordinating schedules for the week ahead, my phone would buzz with another notification from that family group chat. And sometimes I'd wonder what Sierra and Brooke were saying to each other, what story they'd constructed about my absence from their lives, what explanations they'd invented for why their husband and brother-in-law had essentially vanished from their social media feeds and family gatherings. But those moments of curiosity passed quickly, because I'd learned something important about the difference between wondering and caring. You can wonder about people who've hurt you without actually caring about their opinions or their comfort or their version of events. You can acknowledge their existence without giving them access to your peace. The greatest message I'd ever sent wasn't a reply to their guilt-driven attempts at reconciliation. It wasn't a carefully crafted text designed to make them understand the depth of their betrayal. It wasn't an angry email or a public social media post calling out their behavior. The greatest message was the life I'd built when no one showed up for me. When their phones lit up with notifications about my interview, about the network, about the memorial service, about the expansion to new cities, they'd understand. Too late, but they'd understand that some people crumble when abandoned and others build something beautiful from the rubble. And me? I was already walking forward, surrounded by chosen family, building bridges that led to places worth going. Never alone again.